My name is Ren, and I was 34 years old when a county records clerk called me on a Wednesday afternoon and told me that a piece of land my family had sold out from under me 11 years earlier had never actually been theirs to sell. I had spent those 11 years taking care of my grandmother, getting up at 5 in the morning to manage her medications, driving her to appointments on roads that turned to mud every spring, watching my aunts and cousins show up at holidays with their opinions and their casseroles, and then leave again while I stayed. And when my grandmother passed, those same aunts sold her 340-acre property within weeks of the funeral, before I had finished going through her kitchen, and when I asked about my place in any of it, my Aunt Loretta said to me, flatly, and without hesitation, "You chose to stay, Ren. That was your decision. Nobody asked you to." I didn't respond. I finished packing the kitchen. I drove home. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't know for years, was that my grandmother had already made her own decision, in her own time, in the precise and unhurried way she did everything. She had filed a document, a very specific document, and it had been sitting in the county records the entire time, waiting for someone to look. The day that clerk called me, everything my family had built on top of that land shifted. The land had been in my grandmother's family since her own grandfather broke it. That is the word she used, broke. As in broke the ground. As in came to a piece of hill country in East Tennessee with nothing worth counting and turned it into something that could be counted. 340 acres of mixed timber and pasture, and one good creek that ran reliably even in dry summers. Her grandfather had worked it as a small cattle operation, and her father had continued that, and by the time my grandmother Opaline inherited it in her early 40s, it was no longer a working farm in any serious sense. The cattle were long gone, the pasture was growing back to cedar and blackberry, but the land itself was there, continuous and specific, and hers in a way that was different from the way most things are owned. Opaline was not a woman who talked about what things were worth in dollars. She talked about what they were worth in other currencies, in years, in work, in the particular quality of knowing a piece of ground well enough to navigate it in the dark. She could name every section of that property by the landmark she associated with it. The long field, which ran northeast along the ridge. The bottom ground, which flooded in February and was lush by May. The stand of old-growth white oak in the northwest corner that her grandfather had refused to sell when the timber company came through in 1931, a decision that had cost him money he needed and that she spoke of with undisguised pride. She had 5 children. My mother was the youngest, and she was the one who had moved the farthest, to western North Carolina, where she met my father, and where I grew up. The other 4 stayed in the general orbit of East Tennessee, within an hour or 2 of the land, close enough to have opinions about it without being close enough to manage it. Those 4, my aunts Loretta and Patrice and my uncle Gerald and my aunt Donna, were not bad people. I want to say that plainly, because I think the story I'm telling can sound like a story about villains, and it isn't. It's a story about people who had been waiting, in the background of their own lives, for a certain inheritance to materialize, and who had organized their expectations around it so thoroughly that they had stopped distinguishing between expecting it and deserving it. My mother died when I was 20. A car accident on a mountain road in January. Ice, a curve, the specific terrible randomness of it. I was in my second year of community college studying veterinary technology, and after the funeral, I went back to school because I didn't know what else to do, and I finished my degree, and I worked for 4 years at a mixed-practice veterinary clinic in Asheville that saw everything from dairy cows to house cats. And I was good at it in the particular way that people are good at things when those things ask something of them that most people won't give. I moved to Opaline's property when I was 23. It began as a summer arrangement. Opaline had been managing alone since her husband, my grandfather Roy, had passed a decade earlier. She was 78, still sharp, still capable of more than most people her age, but the property was large and her mobility was decreasing, and there were things, the generator maintenance, the road that needed grading every spring, the medical appointments that required an hour's drive each way, that were becoming difficult to manage alone. My aunts and uncle had a phone call about it. I was not on that call, but I was told afterward by Loretta that they had discussed the situation and agreed that someone should probably check in more regularly. Loretta herself lived 40 minutes away and had a full schedule. Patrice lived in Knoxville with her husband and 2 teenagers. Gerald had a contracting business in Maryville. Donna lived closest, perhaps 25 minutes away, but had health issues of her own. Nobody volunteered. I drove up from Asheville on a Saturday in June with 2 weeks of clothes and my veterinary tools and a road atlas, and I stayed for 11 years. I want to be precise about what those 11 years looked like because precision is the only honest way to describe them. The veterinary work I continued, contracting with 2 rural practices in the surrounding counties that needed someone who could do large animal calls and wasn't afraid of the back roads. I worked 3 to 4 days a week depending on the season and Opaline's needs, and I arranged my schedule around her appointments and her rhythms. I managed her medications. She took 6 different prescriptions by the time she was in her mid-80s, and the interactions and timing requirements were specific enough that I kept a written chart on the refrigerator and reviewed it every morning. I drove her to her cardiologist in Knoxville 4 times a year, to her eye doctor twice a year, to her primary care physician monthly. I handled the property maintenance that I could manage myself and hired out what I couldn't, vetting contractors with the wariness of someone who had watched rural property owners get taken advantage of before. I cooked. I cleaned. I sat with her in the evenings when the television was on, and she wanted company, and I read in the chair beside her. I learned the land the way she had taught me to learn it, by walking it, by paying attention, by knowing where the creek ran high in March, and where the deer came through in October. I fixed fence. I kept the generator serviced. I cut the cedar that was encroaching on the long field because Opaline said her grandfather had kept it clear, and she wanted it kept clear. My aunts and uncle visited. They came at Thanksgiving and sometimes Christmas. They called on birthdays. They asked, regularly and with what I took to be genuine concern, how Opaline was doing, and I told them, and they expressed gratitude, and they left again. Loretta said once on the phone, "I don't know what we'd do without you, Wren." She said it warmly, and she meant it in the moment, and it had no operational consequences. Opaline noticed things. She was a quiet woman but an observant one, and she had lived long enough to have very clear opinions about the difference between the people who showed up and the people who intended to show up. She said, once, when I was fixing the gate latch on the south pasture and she was sitting in the truck watching, "Your mother would be glad you're here." She said it without looking at me. I didn't respond. I finished the latch and got back in the truck, and we drove back to the house without discussing it further. She said another time, in the last year of her life when her mobility had decreased significantly and we spent more evenings on the porch than we had before, "I've taken care of what needs taking care of. You don't need to worry about the land." She said it the way she said most important things, as a statement of fact, complete and self-contained, not an invitation to ask questions. I noted it. I filed it alongside the other things she had said sideways over 11 years. I did not ask what she meant. Opaline passed in the early spring of the year I turned 34. She went in her sleep, in the house she had lived in for 60 years, in the bed she had shared with my grandfather until he died, and that she had slept in alone for 20 years after. I found her in the morning when I came in to start her medications. The day was cold and very clear, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the old white oaks in the northwest corner were just beginning to bud. I called the appropriate people. Then I sat on the porch for a long time and looked at the land. My aunts arrived within 48 hours. Loretta came first, from her house 40 minutes away, arriving before noon on the day after Opaline passed. She walked through the house with the particular focused attention I had seen in her before, the attention of someone assessing rather than grieving, and she was kind to me, genuinely kind, in the way that people are kind when they are also moving quickly toward something. She said, "Wren, you've done such an incredible job here."
Truly. We all know that.
Patrice drove down from Knoxville that afternoon with her husband Dale. Gerald arrived the following morning. Donna came that evening. By the second day after Opaline's passing, all 4 of them were in the house, and the machinery of family decision-making had begun operating at a speed that I found, watching it from the kitchen, slightly disorienting. They had a meeting. I was in the room. It happened at the kitchen table, and I was making coffee, and they didn't ask me to leave, but I was not, in any functional sense, part of it. The meeting was about the estate. It was about the land, specifically, and what to do with it, and the answer they arrived at with a unanimity that suggested prior discussion had already happened was that the land should be sold. Gerald said, "None of us is in a position to manage 340 acres. That's just the reality. He said this reasonably, with the tone of a man stating an uncontested fact. Loretta said, "There's a buyer who's already expressed interest. A timber company, and also a developer who's been acquiring parcels in the county. We could get a fair number." She said this carefully, not looking at me. I said, "Has the will been read?" Patrice said, "We've been in contact with Mom's attorney. The estate is straightforward. The property goes to her children." She paused. "We're all going to share in whatever the land brings, Ren. We haven't forgotten that you were here." I noted the phrasing. "We haven't forgotten that you were here." As if my presence were a consideration to be weighed, a variable to be factored, rather than 11 years of daily operational reality. I said, "When is the will reading?" Loretta said, "Next week." But Ren, honestly, there's nothing in the will that changes the situation. Mom always talked about the land staying in the family, but the practical reality is that none of us can manage it. I said, "I've been managing it." There was a brief silence. Loretta said, "You've been wonderful."
We know that.
"But you've been doing it as," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "as a personal choice. Nobody expected you to give up your life for this." I said, "I didn't give up my life. This was my life." She said, Of course it was. And we're grateful." She put her hand briefly on my arm. "We just need to be practical about what comes next." That was the word they kept using. Practical. The will reading happened 8 days after Opaline's passing, in the office of her attorney, a general practice lawyer in the county seat named Howard, who had been Opaline's attorney for estate matters for 20 years. Howard was in his 70s, methodical, the kind of lawyer whose office is full of paper files and manila folders because he has never fully converted to digital systems and sees no reason to. He read the will efficiently. It left the property to Opaline's 5 children. My mother shared a past to her children, which meant to me. I was named specifically as my mother's heir, which meant I had a 1/5 interest on paper. My aunts and uncle received 4/5 between them. After the reading, Loretta spoke to Howard briefly, while the others filed out. I heard the words "moving forward with the sale" and "timeline" and "has she been told about the offer?" I had not been told about any offer. In the car on the way back to the property, Patrice told me, "There's a buyer, a land acquisition company that was assembling parcels for a mixed-use development and timber operation. The offer was for the full 340 acres at a price she named, which was a figure I processed and filed away. Closing was proposed for 6 weeks out." She said, "Your share of the proceeds will be your 5th. It's a fair number, Ren. You'll be able to start fresh somewhere." I said, "Start fresh?" She said, "You've been out here for 11 years. This is a chance to do something different. Mom would have wanted you to have a life." I looked out the window at the long field, which was coming green along the ridge. I said, "When were you planning to tell me about the offer?" She said, "We're telling you now. We wanted to have the will reading first, so everything was official." I said, "Okay." She said, "You're not. You don't have to be upset about this. This is the right decision." I said, "I'm not upset." And I wasn't exactly. I was something else, a stillness that had settled in my chest somewhere around the kitchen table meeting and hadn't moved. I was paying attention. I was doing what I had always done, which was watch carefully and say very little, and let what was real make itself visible in its own time. The sale moved forward. I attended the meetings I was asked to attend. I signed what I was asked to sign as a 1/5 interest holder. I did not obstruct. I did not make speeches. I packed the things from the house that were mine, and the things from the house that had been Opaline's that I asked about and was given her recipe box, 3 of her quilts, a framed photograph of her, and my grandfather taken in the year they were married. I thanked my aunts and uncle for including me, and I drove back to Asheville, and I started a new job at a small animal clinic, and I rented an apartment near the river, and I built a different kind of life. And I did not think, not for a long time, about Opaline saying I've taken care of what needs taking care of. I should tell you when I started thinking about it again. It was the 2nd year after the sale. I had a colleague at the clinic, a veterinarian named Sue Jean who had grown up in rural Kentucky and who had an instinct for property matters that came from watching her own family navigate farm inheritance. We were eating lunch in the back of the clinic one afternoon, and I was telling her about the land, about how the sale had gone about my 1/5, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Did you ever do a full title search, going back before the will?" I said I hadn't. I said the will had been clear. She said, "Wills dispose of what the deceased owned at the time of death. They can't dispose of what was already transferred before death." She said it in the same tone she used to explain parasite life cycles, matter of fact, informational. If your grandmother ever transferred any interest in that property to you before she died, it would be in the county records regardless of what the will said. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "She told me she'd taken care of what needed taking care of." Sue Jean set down her sandwich. She said, "Wren, you should call the county recorder's office."
I did not call that day.
Or that week. I turned it over for nearly a month, because the thing about being told that the ground under a major event in your life might be different from what you were shown is that it takes time to decide whether you want to look. I had built the life after the land. I had done it carefully and practically, and I was okay. I was not sure I wanted to unsettle that. But I had been raised by a woman who said a piece of ground is worth knowing, and I had spent 11 years learning what she meant by that, and in the end I picked up the phone. I called the county recorder's office on a Friday morning in October, nearly 2 years after the sale had closed. The clerk who answered was a woman named Darlene, and she had the particular combination of precision and patience that comes from spending a career in public records. She knew her system the way Opaline had known the land, which is to say completely, and without having to think about it. I gave her the parcel number, which I still had in the file folder of closing documents I'd kept in a drawer in my apartment, and she pulled the record. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm seeing a standard chain of title here going back to the original survey. There was a transfer of ownership recorded." Another pause. "Let me pull the instrument." I heard the sound of keys. Then, "Okay. There's a recorded warranty deed here, filed about 6 years before the sale, transferring a 50% undivided interest in the parcel to," she read the name, "Wren Elise Mabry." "That's you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "This was recorded and indexed. Book 4892, page 317. It's in the public record." She paused. "Were you aware of this?" I said, "No." She said, "There's a recorded transfer. It predates the sale by about 6 years. Whoever handled that closing would have found this in a standard title search." Something went very cold and very quiet inside me. Not all at once, it was more like a room dropping temperature, gradual and then complete. I said, "Did the closing company run a full title search?" She said, "I can't speak to what they did or didn't find. What I can tell you is that this instrument is in the record. It's indexed under your name." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my apartment for a while. The October light was coming through the window over the river, and it was the particular flat gold light of late afternoon in fall, and I looked at it for a long time. Then I called a property attorney. Her name was Beverly, a real estate and title law specialist in Asheville who had been recommended to me by Sue Jean, who had used her for a land matter of her own. Beverly was methodical and direct. I told her what Darlene had told me. She asked for the parcel number and the book and page reference. She pulled the record herself while I was on the phone. She said, "This is a properly recorded warranty deed, executed by the grantor, your grandmother, and filed with the county recorder 6 years prior to the sale of the property. It transferred a 50% undivided interest to you by name." I said, "The sale went through without my signature." Beverly said, "If this instrument is valid, and on its face it is, then 50% of that property was not your grandmother's to sell or to include in her estate at the time of her death. It was already yours. The sale of the whole parcel, without your consent as a 50% owner of record, was not a clean transfer of title." I said, "What does that mean practically?" She said, "It means there are legal avenues available to you." She paused. "Can you come in?" I went in the following Monday. What Beverly outlined, over the course of 2 hours with the deed in front of us, and the title history spread across her conference table, was a situation that was both legally clear and practically complex. The land had been sold to a development company. The development company had paid for it and had since begun preliminary work on it. They had a title insurance policy. That policy had been issued on the basis of a title search that had either missed or disregarded a recorded instrument that was available to anyone who looked at the county records. Beverly said, "The title insurer has exposure here. The development company may have exposure. Your family certainly has exposure." She said it without relish, just information, laid out the way a vet lays out a diagnosis. This is going to involve multiple parties. It's going to involve a title company that issued the policy, and it will likely involve a formal proceeding to establish your interest and determine remedies. I asked what remedies looked like. She said, "In the best case, a monetary settlement that reflects the value of your recorded 50% interest in the property at the time of sale. Potentially more, depending on what the title search failure looks like on the insurance end." She looked at me. "Your grandmother transferred half that land to you. Whoever sold it, including your family, sold something that wasn't entirely theirs to sell." I sat with that. Then I told Beverly to proceed. The formal proceeding that followed was what brought my family back into a room together. Beverly had sent formal written notice to my aunts and uncle, to Howard the estate attorney, and to the title insurance company. Howard responded first, through a letter that had the specific quality of a document written by someone who had just discovered a problem they did not know existed and was uncertain how to account for it. My aunts and uncle did not respond directly. Loretta called Beverly's office and was told, politely and precisely, that all communication should go through counsel. The proceeding took place in a conference room at the title insurance company's regional office, a clean, modern building in Knoxville, fluorescent light, a long table, too many chairs. Beverly and I arrived first. Howard arrived with a younger associate from his firm who carried the files. The title insurer's in-house counsel, a woman named Margot, composed and watchful, sat at one end with two colleagues. My aunts arrived together. Loretta, Patrice, and Donna. Gerald had sent his own attorney in his place, which told me something about how he had assessed the situation. Loretta looked at me when she came in. There was something in her face that I had not seen before, not hostility, not warmth, but a careful attention, the look of a person recalibrating. She said, "Ren." I said, "Loretta." We sat across from each other. Margot called the room to order. She was the kind of person who was very good at managing a room full of people who all believed different versions of the same events, and she did it with a thoroughness that I appreciated. She said, "We're here because a title claim has been raised against a policy-issued incident to the sale of the parcel. That claim is based on a recorded instrument that was not identified in the title search conducted prior to closing." She looked around the table. "I'm going to ask our examiner to walk through what the county records show." The examiner was a man named Curtis, young, careful, wearing a tie that was slightly too tight. He had a printout of the title history in front of him. He walked through the chain of title from the original deed forward, methodically, the way you walk a fence line, post by post. He reached the instrument in question. He read the book and page reference. He said, "At this point in the chain we have a recorded warranty deed, executed by Opaline Ruth Mabry, transferring a 50% undivided interest in the parcel to Ren Elise Mabry, dated and filed 6 years prior to the sale." He looked up. This instrument was in the public record at the time of the title examination. It was not identified in the search report. The room went silent. Not gradually, all at once, the way a room goes silent when a fact enters it that nobody has a prepared response to. Loretta's hands, which had been resting on the table in front of her, moved to her lap. Howard's associate stopped taking notes. Margot looked at the printout with the focused expression of someone confirming what she already knew but needed to see confirmed. Curtis continued. He noted that the instrument was properly executed, properly witnessed, notarized, and indexed. He noted that the grantor's name and the grantee's name were both clearly legible and correctly rendered. He noted that the parcel description in the deed matched the parcel description in the subsequent sale documents exactly. He noted that there was no recorded revocation or reconveyance of the interest at any point after the original filing. He said, "The instrument is valid on its face. The interest transferred by this deed was not part of the grantor's estate at the time of her death and was not available for disposition by will or sale." Beverly said, into the quiet, "My client held a 50% undivided interest in this property at the time of sale. That interest was transferred without her knowledge or consent. The title policy was issued on the basis of an incomplete search." Margot said, "We acknowledge the instrument. We acknowledge the search failure." She said it without effect. She was a professional doing a professional thing, which was acknowledging reality so that the room could move toward resolution. Howard said, and I want to be precise about how he said this because it matters, he said, the estate was administered in good faith. We were not aware of a prior transfer." He said it quietly, and he said it to the table rather than to anyone in particular, and I believed him. He had been Opaline's attorney for 20 years, and he had not known she had done this, and the gap between what he had believed he was administering and what was actually in the county records was visible in the very careful way he chose each word. Loretta said, "Why didn't Mom tell anyone?" Nobody answer her. Because nobody in that room could answer her. Only Opaline could have answered her, and Opaline was not there. What I thought, sitting at that table, was, she did tell someone. She told me, on the porch, in the particular sideways language she used for everything that mattered. "I've taken care of what needs taking care of." She had said it, and I had heard it, and I had not known at the time exactly what it meant. But she had known I would be in the room when it mattered. She had filed the document and put my name on it and trusted the record to do the work she could not do directly. I did not say any of this at the table. I kept my hands flat in front of me and my face steady, and I let Beverly handle the room, which she did with a precision and composure that I have thought about many times since. What came out of that meeting, over the course of 2.5 hours and several recesses and a great deal of quiet legal discussion, was a framework for resolution. The title insurer acknowledged liability under the policy for the search failure. The development company was involved through their own counsel in a parallel process. My family, my aunts' and uncles' estates, faced their own exposure for having received proceeds from the sale of an asset that was partially not theirs to sell. I will not detail every element of what followed because it is long and technical and, in the end, less interesting than the fact of it. What I will tell you is that the resolution accounted for my 50% interest in a property that had been sold, the assessed value of that interest at the time of sale, as Beverly had framed it. The figure was in the range of values that Patrice had named as the full sale price, adjusted for my share. It came through a combination of the insurance payout and the recovery from the estate proceeds.
It was documented.
It was final. It was what Opaline had intended for me to have. The weeks after the Knoxville meeting were quiet in a way that was different from the quiet I had lived in before. My aunts did not call immediately. Gerald's attorney sent a brief written communication to Beverly acknowledging the resolution framework. Howard sent a formal letter that was correct in every legal particular and that contained, in its final paragraph, a sentence that I have kept. The estate acknowledges that the instrument in question was a valid expression of the grantor's intent, and we regret that its existence was not identified during the administration process. I read that sentence several times. I thought about Howard sitting in his office full of manila folders, drafting it. I thought about what it costs to write a sentence like that when you have been practicing law for 40 years and have never had a situation quite like this one. Loretta called me 3 weeks after the meeting. She did not open with an apology. She opened, as Marcus had in the other story, though she didn't know Marcus, of course, with logistics, with the timeline, with the question of what I was planning to do next. We got through those things. And then there was a silence, and she said, "I keep thinking about what Mom said to you, on the porch or wherever, that she'd taken care of things." I said, "She said it more than once." Loretta said, We didn't know. I want you to know that." I said, "I know you didn't know." She said, "I shouldn't have said what I said. After the funeral, about you having chosen to stay." I said, "No." She said, "We took it for granted. All of it. We took you for granted." I sat with that for a moment, It was true, and she knew it was true, and saying it out loud did not undo it, but it did something. It named the thing. And sometimes naming the thing is the only restitution that's actually available. I said, I know that too. We stayed on the phone a while longer. Patrice called 2 days after that. Donna sent a letter, an actual paper letter, handwritten, which surprised me, and which I have kept with a photograph of Opaline and my grandfather. Gerald did not call, but his attorney's communication had been professional and prompt, and I took that as his version of acknowledgement. The land itself, the 340 acres, the long field and the bottom ground and the old white oaks, remained in the possession of the development company, which had purchased it legitimately and was not a party to the family's error. The resolution did not return the land to me.
I want to be honest about that.
The land was gone in the sense that I could not walk it anymore, could not fix the south gate or watch the deer come through the northwest corner in October. But the value of what Opaline had set aside for me had reached me. She had made sure of that from the beginning. She had done it quietly and completely, and without telling anyone except the county recorder, and the county recorder had written it in a book and indexed it under my name and waited. I did not sell my apartment. I did not move. What I did, in the months that followed, was look for land. Not 340 acres. I was not in a position for that, and I was not sure I wanted to replicate what I had known rather than find what came next. But I found 12 acres in the hill country an hour east of Asheville, mixed timber and a small pasture, and a creek that ran reliably even in dry summers, and I made an offer, and the offer was accepted, and I signed my name on the deed and kept a copy in a file I labeled clearly. I check it sometimes. Not often. Just to confirm it says what it says. My grandmother never explained herself. She was not that kind of person. She made decisions and executed them and filed the paperwork and trusted that the record would hold, because she had lived long enough to know that the record holds when everything else is gone. She had watched people inherit things they hadn't earned and lose things they had. She had watched the family dynamics that develop around land, the assumptions, the hierarchies, the way proximity to a thing that has value creates a sense of ownership that can outlast any actual claim. She had watched it all, from her porch, with the patience of someone who had a very long view. And then she had gone to see an attorney, and she had done the things she wanted to do, and she had come home and made dinner, and sat on the porch and said, I've taken care of what needs taking care of, and that was the end of her part of it. Here is what I have taken from all of it. The people who actually do the work rarely announce it. They just do it day after day, and trust that the doing is its own kind of record. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the person they were doing it for understood that and did their own quiet paperwork and made sure the record caught up eventually. You can't always know when the record will surface. But if it was made honestly and filed correctly, it does not go away. It waits. It holds. And one day a clerk pulls a file and reads a name, and the room goes quiet. That's my story. A porch in East Tennessee, a deed in the county records, and a clerk named Darlene who pulled the right file on a Friday afternoon. Before I go, I want to ask you something. My grandmother never told me directly what she had done. She said I've taken care of what needs taking care of, and she trusted me to be paying enough attention to hold on to it, even when I didn't know yet what I was holding. She communicated in actions and in the specific language of a person who trusts records more than promises. Have you ever been the one who did the quiet work, the daily, unglamorous, invisible work of caring for someone or something, while everyone around you managed from a comfortable distance? And did you ever get a moment, even a small one, where that work was acknowledged? Not rewarded, necessarily, just seen? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.